The mahogany doors of Whitman and Associates creaked as I stepped into the law office that Tuesday morning. 23 family members had gathered in the conference room, all dressed in their finest black attire, whispering among themselves about Uncle Theodore's fortune. I took a seat in the back corner, expecting nothing. After all, I was just the nephew who'd been written off years ago. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The morning started like any other, except for the knot in my stomach that had been growing tighter since I received the call 3 days earlier. "Theodore Blackwood has passed," the voice on the phone had said. "There will be a reading of his will on Tuesday at 10 a.m. I almost didn't go. Uncle Theodore and I hadn't spoken in over 8 years, not since that explosive argument at Christmas dinner when I was 22. I remember that night vividly. The whole family had gathered at his sprawling estate in Millbrook Heights, the same house where he'd built his empire from nothing. Uncle Theodore had started with a single hardware store and somehow turned it into a chain of 37 locations across 3 states. Everyone respected him, feared him even. He was the kind of man who remembered every slight, every favor, every debt. That Christmas, I'd made the mistake of suggesting that maybe, just maybe, he could treat his employees better, pay them more than minimum wage, offer decent health insurance. Uncle Theodore's face had turned crimson, and he'd stood up from the dinner table like thunder itself was rising. "You ungrateful little idealist," he'd snarled. "You think money grows on trees? You think running a business is about making friends?" The argument escalated quickly. I called him greedy. He called me naive. My cousins, Marcus, Diana, and Patricia. They all sat there in silence, not wanting to risk their own positions in his good graces. My Aunt Lillian tried to mediate, but it was too late. Uncle Theodore pointed toward the door and told me to leave. "Don't come back until you understand how the real world works," he'd said. So I left. I walked out of that mansion and didn't look back. The years that followed were tough. I worked construction jobs, waited tables, did whatever it took to get by. I went back to school, earned my degree in social work, and eventually landed a position at Riverside Community Center. The pay was terrible, but I loved the work. I helped families find housing, connected kids with after-school programs, and ran support groups for people struggling with addiction. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt meaningful. Meanwhile, my cousins all found their places in Uncle Theodore's business empire. Marcus became the operations manager. Diana handled marketing and public relations. Patricia took over human resources. They drove luxury cars, lived in expensive neighborhoods, and posted photos from European vacations on social media. Sometimes I wondered if I'd made the right choice, walking away from all that potential wealth. But I never reached out. Pride, maybe, or principle, probably both. Now, sitting in that leather chair in the law office, I watched my family members adjust their ties and smooth their dresses. They looked confident, expectant. Marcus kept checking his Rolex. Diana was already mentally redecorating Uncle Theodore's study, I could tell from the way she kept glancing at the architectural drawings she'd brought along. Patricia had spreadsheets, actual spreadsheets, calculating inheritance tax implications. The lawyer, Mr. Harrison Whitman, was a thin man in his 60s, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He'd been Uncle Theodore's attorney for over 20 years. He cleared his throat and opened a thick manila folder. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice carrying the weight of ceremony. "Theodore Blackwood was very specific about how he wanted this handled. I'll be reading the will in its entirety, as per his instructions." The room fell silent. Even the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to pause. Mr. Whitman began with the smaller bequests. Uncle Theodore's housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, received $50,000 and a glowing letter of recommendation. His longtime mechanic got $25,000, and Uncle Theodore's vintage Mustang. The gardener inherited the greenhouse and all the tools. Then came the family distributions. To Marcus, the flagship hardware store in downtown Millbrook, and a trust fund worth $2 million. Marcus actually smiled. The first genuine smile I'd seen from him in years. To Diana, the marketing company Uncle Theodore had acquired 5 years earlier, plus the lake house in Vermont, and $1.5 million in stocks and bonds. Diana dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, though whether from grief or joy I couldn't tell. To Patricia, 3 of the smaller hardware locations, the condo in Florida, and $1 million in cash. She nodded approvingly, already making notes in her planner. Aunt Lillian received the family jewelry, some artwork, and a modest but comfortable retirement fund. Several other relatives got varying amounts, some more generous than others, but everyone seemed satisfied. I sat there listening, genuinely happy for them. These were good people, despite our differences. They'd maintained relationships with Uncle Theodore while I'd chosen my stubborn path. They deserved whatever he'd left them. As the reading continued, I found myself thinking about the last conversation I'd had with Aunt Lillian about Uncle Theodore. It was about 6 months ago, when she'd called to tell me he'd been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. "He asks about you sometimes," she'd said quietly. "I wonder what you're doing, if you're happy." "He has my number," I'd replied, though not unkindly. "He knows where I work." "You know how he is, David." Too proud to make the first move. I'd almost called him then, almost swallowed my own pride and picked up the phone. But I didn't. I told myself I was protecting my peace of mind, avoiding another confrontation. Now, sitting in that conference room, I wondered if I'd been protecting something else entirely, my own stubborn sense of righteousness. The clock continued ticking. Mr. Whitman's voice droned on, listing assets and account numbers. I glanced around the room, noting how my cousins were already planning their futures. Marcus was texting someone, probably his wife. Diana had pulled out her phone to call her financial advisor. Patricia was scheduling meetings. I checked my own phone. I had 3 missed calls from work. Probably Mrs. Rodriguez asking about her housing application, or maybe James needed help with his job interview preparation. Real life was waiting for me outside these mahogany walls. Mr. Whitman was nearing the end of the document. He'd covered the business holdings, the real estate, the investments, the personal effects. My name hadn't been mentioned once, which was exactly what I'd expected. Uncle Theodore had made his feelings clear that Christmas night 8 years ago. "And finally," Mr. Whitman said, adjusting his glasses, "we come to the matter of the primary residence and surrounding property at 847 Elmwood Manor Drive." The entire room leaned forward. This was the crown jewel, Uncle Theodore's estate, worth at least $8 million. The house where he'd hosted legendary 4th of July parties, where 3 generations of Blackwoods had celebrated milestones, where power and influence had been cultivated, like the prize-winning roses in the garden. I assumed it would go to Marcus, as the eldest nephew and heir apparent to the business empire. Or maybe it would be split among the 3 cousins. Uncle Theodore had always been unpredictable, but he wasn't cruel. Mr. Whitman paused, scanning the document one more time. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. Then he looked directly at me. "David Michael Blackwood," Mr. Whitman announced, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "To you, I leave the house at 847 Elmwood Manor Drive, including all furnishings, the surrounding 15 acres, and the contents of the study safe." The room erupted. Marcus shot to his feet so fast his chair toppled backward. "That's impossible," he shouted. "David hasn't spoken to Uncle Theodore in years." Diana's face had gone white as parchment. "There has to be a mistake. Check the document again." Patricia was frantically flipping through her spreadsheets, as if the numbers might somehow change the reality of what we'd just heard. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered. The estate was supposed to be divided among the primary heirs. I sat frozen, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. The house? Uncle Theodore's mansion? The place I'd been banished from 8 years ago? Mr. Whitman raised his hand for silence. "There is an accompanying letter," he said, pulling out a sealed envelope with my name written in Uncle Theodore's distinctive handwriting. Mr. Blackwood requested that this be read aloud. He broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The paper was cream-colored, expensive, the kind Uncle Theodore had always used for his important correspondence. "David," Mr. Whitman began reading, "if you're hearing this, then I'm finally free from this stubborn old body that's been failing me for months. I suppose you're wondering why I've left you the house. Hell, I imagine everyone in that room is wondering the same thing." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd, but the tension remained thick. "The truth is, I've been thinking about our argument for 8 years. Every Christmas, every family gathering, every time I walked past your empty chair at the dinner table, I told myself I was right, that you were naive, that business requires tough decisions and tougher people. But something happened 6 months ago that changed everything. Mr. Whitman paused, glancing around the room before continuing. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. I was diagnosed with cancer, as most of you know. During one of my treatment sessions at Riverside General, I saw a familiar face. It was you, David, though you didn't see me. You were in the children's wing, sitting with a little girl who was crying. Her parents were in the hallway, arguing with insurance representatives about coverage for her treatment. You stayed with that child for 2 hours, reading her stories, making her laugh, giving her parents the time they needed to fight for her care. My throat tightened. I remembered that day. 8-year-old Sophia Martinez. Her family had been struggling with medical bills, and I'd been helping them navigate the system for weeks. I asked the nurse about you, the letter continued. She told me you volunteer there every week, that you've been doing it for 3 years. She said you help families who can't afford treatment, that you translate for Spanish-speaking patients, that you've never missed a week except when you had pneumonia, and even then, you tried to come in. Marcus had stopped pacing. Diana's hands had fallen to her lap. Patricia was no longer checking her phone. I started investigating what you'd been doing with your life since you walked out of my house. I hired a private investigator. Don't be angry. I was dying and I needed to know. What I learned humbled me in ways I never expected. Mr. Whitman turned the page. You worked 3 jobs to put yourself through college. You graduated summa cum laude with a degree in social work, then turned down a corporate job that would have paid you 6 figures to work at a community center for barely above minimum wage. You've helped over 200 families find stable housing. You've run addiction support groups that have helped dozens of people get clean. You started a scholarship program using your own money you could barely spare, to help kids from low-income families attend college. I felt heat rising in my cheeks. I'd never told anyone in the family about any of this. How had Uncle Theodore found out? But what really got to me, the letter went on, was learning about the Henderson family. Do you remember them, David? Robert Henderson worked at one of my stores for 11 years. Good employee, never missed a day, always polite to customers. I fired him because he asked for time off when his wife was dying of cancer. I called it a business decision. I said I couldn't set a precedent of giving special treatment. The room had gone completely silent. Even the grandfather clock seemed to have stopped ticking. 3 months after I fired Robert, his wife died. He lost their house. He and his 2 kids ended up in a homeless shelter. That's where you found them, David. You didn't just help Robert find a new job. You helped him find 3 job opportunities so he could choose the best one. You co-signed the lease on their apartment because his credit was destroyed. You bought school supplies for his kids and drove them to their first day at their new school. Aunt Lillian was crying now, quiet tears streaming down her face. Robert Henderson called me 2 weeks before I died. He wanted to thank the family for raising someone like you. He said you saved his life, that his kids were thriving, that he'd been promoted twice at his new job. He said you never asked for anything in return, never even told him we were related. Mr. Whitman's voice grew softer as he read the final paragraphs. I built an empire, David, but you built something more important. You built a legacy of compassion. I accumulated wealth, but you created worth. I was so busy being right that I forgot to be good. You chose to be good even when it meant being poor. My cousins were staring at me with expressions I couldn't quite read. Surprise, certainly, but maybe something else. Respect? The house is yours because it needs someone who understands that a home isn't about the value of its contents, but about the love within its walls. I'm hoping you'll fill it with the kind of warmth it's been missing since your grandmother died. The safe contains some things I think you'll find interesting, including the deed to a piece of property downtown that I purchased specifically for you. Marcus leaned forward. What property downtown? Mr. Whitman continued reading. To my other beloved family members, please don't be angry with David or with me. You've all received substantial inheritances that will secure your futures. David has already secured his future by choosing to live a life of purpose. I'm simply giving him the tools to expand that purpose. The letter was nearly finished. David, I hope you can forgive a stubborn old man who took too long to realize that you were right and I was wrong. That Christmas night 8 years ago, you said I should treat my employees like human beings instead of profit margins. You were right. You said money isn't everything. You were right. You said business should serve people, not the other way around. You were right about it all. Mr. Whitman folded the letter carefully. The final paragraph is personal, he said, handing me the letter. Mr. Blackwood requested that you read it privately. I took the letter with shaking hands. The room remained silent as I unfolded it and read Uncle Theodore's final words to me. I love you, David. I always have. I was just too proud and too afraid to say it. Thank you for becoming the man I should have been. Make the house a home again. Your Uncle Theodore. I looked up to find 23 pairs of eyes watching me. Some looked shocked. Others seemed to be reassessing everything they thought they knew about Uncle Theodore, about me, about our family dynamics. Mr. Whitman reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick envelope. The deed to the house, he said, placing it in my hands. And the keys. He handed me a ring with 3 keys. The front door, the back door, and one I didn't recognize. That third key, he explained, opens the safe in the study. Mr. Blackwood left specific instructions that you're to examine its contents privately before deciding what to do with them. I stared at the keys in my palm, their weight somehow both lighter and heavier than I'd expected. Marcus was the first to break the silence. David, I had no idea about any of this. His voice had lost its earlier hostility, replaced by something closer to bewilderment. Uncle Theodore never mentioned the Henderson family, or your volunteer work, or… Why would he? I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. We weren't exactly on speaking terms. Diana stood up slowly, smoothing her dress with trembling hands. I remember Robert Henderson. I handled his termination paperwork. She looked down at her manicured nails. I never questioned it. Uncle Theodore said he was setting a bad example by requesting time off, and I just processed the dismissal. Patricia closed her laptop with a sharp snap. We need to talk, she said, but not unkindly. All of us. There's obviously a lot we don't understand about what's been happening in this family. Mr. Whitman began gathering his papers. If there are no legal challenges to the will, I believe our business here will be concluded. Mr. David Blackwood, I'll need you to sign several documents to transfer ownership officially, but that can wait until tomorrow if you prefer. I nodded, still staring at the keys. Tomorrow is fine. As the family members began filing out of the conference room, Aunt Lillian approached me. Her eyes were red from crying, but she was smiling. Theodore would be so proud, she said, squeezing my hand. He talked about you more than you know, especially these last few months. Why didn't he ever call? I asked. Same reason you never called him, she replied gently. Blackwood men and their pride. She kissed my cheek. But love always finds a way, doesn't it? After everyone left, I sat alone in the conference room for nearly an hour, trying to process what had just happened. The grandfather clock ticked steadily, marking time that felt both frozen and racing. My phone buzzed with text messages. Word was already spreading through the family network, apparently. Cousins I hadn't heard from in years were suddenly very interested in reconnecting. Finally, I drove to Elmwood Manor Drive. I'd driven past the house occasionally over the years, usually by accident when taking unfamiliar routes through the city. Each time, I'd felt a mixture of nostalgia and resentment, remembering both the happy childhood memories and that final, terrible argument. Now, as I pulled into the circular driveway, those emotions were joined by something entirely new. Ownership. This was mine now. The thought felt surreal. The house stood exactly as I remembered it, a massive Victorian with bay windows, wraparound porches, and elaborate trim work painted in deep burgundy and cream. The garden was immaculate, clearly maintained by the same landscaping service Uncle Theodore had used for decades. The oak trees I'd climbed as a child had grown taller, their branches now reaching the second-story windows. I walked to the front door, key in hand, but hesitated. This felt like crossing a threshold into a completely different life. Behind this door were rooms full of memories, furniture that had witnessed 3 generations of family celebrations and arguments. And somewhere upstairs, Uncle Theodore's study with its mysterious safe. The key turned easily. The door swung open to reveal the grand foyer with its marble floors and crystal chandelier. Everything was exactly as I remembered, yet somehow different. Smaller, maybe, or less intimidating. When I was a child, this house seemed like a palace. Now it just felt like a very large, very quiet home. I walked through the room slowly, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The living room where we'd opened Christmas presents. The dining room where that fateful argument had occurred. The kitchen where Grandmother Blackwood had taught me to make her famous apple pie. Every corner held a memory, some painful, others precious. Uncle Theodore's study was on the second floor, behind heavy oak doors that had always been off-limits during family gatherings. I'd only been inside twice as a child, once when I was 7 and had hidden there during a game of hide-and-seek, and once when I was 12 and Uncle Theodore had caught me reading one of his business books. The room was exactly as I remembered. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a massive desk facing the window, leather chairs arranged around a fireplace, and in the corner, a large safe built into the wall. It was the kind of safe you'd see in old movies, black steel with a combination lock and a brass handle. The third key fit perfectly. The safe opened with a satisfying click, revealing several shelves lined with documents, small boxes, and what appeared to be personal items. On the top shelf was an envelope marked, "Read this first." Inside was another letter in Uncle Theodore's handwriting, this one much shorter. "David, if you're reading this, then you've accepted the house and hopefully forgiven an old fool his mistakes. What you'll find in this safe represents 30 years of regret and recent attempts at redemption. Take your time going through everything. Some of it will surprise you. Some of it might anger you. All of it is yours now, to do with as you see fit. The property deed I mentioned is in the blue folder. You'll understand why I bought it when you see the address. T.B. I pulled out the blue folder first. Inside was a deed for a building downtown on Hamilton Street. The address was familiar, but I couldn't immediately place it. Then it hit me. It was right next to the Riverside Community Center where I worked. The building had been vacant for months, with a for sale sign that never seemed to change. There was a note attached to the deed, for the David Blackwood Community Health Center. Because everyone deserves access to health care, regardless of their ability to pay. My knees went weak. Uncle Theodore had bought me a building to expand the community center's services, the same community center where he'd seen me volunteering with sick children, a building that would allow us to offer basic medical care, mental health services, and addiction counseling, all in one location. I sat down heavily in Uncle Theodore's desk chair and continued exploring the safe's contents. There was a savings account passbook showing a balance of $500,000 money specifically designated for renovating and equipping the new health center. There were business cards for contractors, medical equipment suppliers, and healthcare professionals who had apparently already been contacted about the project. In a small wooden box, I found something that made me gasp. My grandmother's wedding ring, along with a note that read, "She always said this should go to the grandson who understood that love is more important than money." But perhaps the most shocking discovery was a thick manila folder labeled Robert Henderson and others. Inside were detailed records of Uncle Theodore's attempts to locate and help every employee he'd ever fired or treated unfairly. There were copies of anonymous donations made to families in need, scholarship funds he'd established for employees' children, and even a letter of recommendation he'd written for Robert Henderson that had helped him land his current job. At the bottom of the folder was a list titled People I Wronged, with nearly 50 names on it. Next to each name were notes about how Uncle Theodore had tried to make amends, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. Robert Henderson's name was at the top, with a checkmark and the notation, "Family restored, children thriving, debt forgiven." I found bank records showing that Uncle Theodore had been quietly funding several community programs for years. The after-school tutoring program at the library, the free lunch program at the elementary school, the scholarship fund that had helped 3 kids from the Henderson family's neighborhood attend college. There were also personal items that revealed a side of Uncle Theodore I'd never known existed, Letters from people thanking him for anonymous acts of kindness. Photos of families he'd helped, sent to him by grateful recipients who didn't know he was the anonymous donor. A journal where he'd written entries about his regrets, his pride in my work, and his desperate wish to reconcile with me. One journal entry, dated just 2 months before his death, particularly stood out. Saw David at the hospital again today. He was helping an elderly man fill out insurance forms. The man couldn't read English well, and David spent an hour patiently explaining everything, then helped him call his daughter to translate the more complex parts. Watching him work, I finally understood what my father tried to teach me all those years ago, that success isn't measured by what you accumulate, but by what you contribute. As I read through these documents, I realized that Uncle Theodore hadn't just left me a house and some money. He'd left me a roadmap for how to use wealth responsibly, and evidence that he'd spent his final years trying to become the kind of man he thought I already was. The safe contained one final surprise: adoption papers for a daughter I'd never known Uncle Theodore had. Her name was Rebecca Santos, and according to the documents, she'd been born when Uncle Theodore was 23 and unmarried. He'd arranged for her adoption but had secretly supported her throughout her life, paying for her education and helping her start her own nonprofit organization in California. There was a letter addressed to me about Rebecca. She doesn't know about the family connection, and I never had the courage to tell her, but she's wonderful, David. She runs a shelter for homeless teenagers in Los Angeles. I think you two would like each other. Her contact information is attached if you want to reach out. I leaned back in the chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I'd discovered. Uncle Theodore hadn't just been the stern businessman I'd known. He'd been a man struggling with his own conscience, trying to balance the hardness he thought business required with the compassion he'd never quite lost. 3 days after the will reading, I was standing in the empty building on Hamilton Street with Marcus, Diana, and Patricia. Word of Uncle Theodore's secret philanthropy had spread through the family, and my cousins had insisted on seeing the property he'd bought for the community health center. The structural engineer says the building is solid, Marcus said, consulting his clipboard. Plumbing and electrical will need updates, but nothing major. Uncle Theodore chose well. Diana ran her hand along the wall near what would become the main entrance. He had architectural plans drawn up, she said, pulling out a rolled set of blueprints. Look at this. He designed spaces for medical examination rooms, a pharmacy, counseling offices, even a children's play area. I unrolled the plans on a makeshift table we'd brought in. The detail was incredible. Uncle Theodore had thought of everything: wheelchair accessibility, soundproofing for the counseling rooms, natural lighting in the waiting areas, even a small kitchen where families could prepare meals while waiting for extended treatments. When did he have time to plan all this? I wondered aloud. Patricia looked up from the financial documents she'd been reviewing. According to these invoices, he started working on this project 8 months ago, right after his diagnosis. He was meeting with architects and contractors while undergoing chemotherapy. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. While Uncle Theodore was fighting for his own life, he'd been planning a facility that would help others fight for theirs. My phone buzzed. It was Dr. Sarah Chen from Riverside Community Center. No relation to Uncle Theodore's housekeeper, despite the shared surname. David, I heard about your inheritance. Congratulations. Are you still planning to come in this week? The Martinez family has been asking about you. I'll be there tomorrow, I replied. And Sarah, I have something important to discuss with you and the board. After my cousins left to handle their own inherited responsibilities, I spent the afternoon walking through the empty building alone, envisioning what it could become. The ground floor could house the medical clinic and pharmacy. The second floor would be perfect for counseling services and support groups. There was even a basement that could be converted into a community meeting space. But as I stood there planning, a nagging worry crept into my mind. Did I deserve this? Uncle Theodore had left me millions of dollars worth of property and resources based on his observations of my character. But what if I couldn't live up to his expectations? What if I made mistakes with the money? What if the health center failed? That evening, I called the number Uncle Theodore had left for Rebecca Santos in Los Angeles. After several rings, a warm voice answered. Hello? Hi, is this Rebecca Santos? Yes, who's this? I took a deep breath. My name is David Blackwood. I believe you knew my uncle Theodore Blackwood. There was a long pause. Mr. Blackwood? From the Blackwood Foundation? Oh my God, I'm so sorry for your loss. Your uncle he was incredible. He funded our shelter for 3 years. I never got to meet him in person, but his donations literally saved our program. Rebecca, this might sound strange, but would you be available to talk sometime this week? I have some information about my uncle that I think you'd want to hear. Of course. Is everything okay? The foundation isn't discontinuing the funding, is it? Because if so, I need to start looking for other donors immediately. No, nothing like that. Actually, it's the opposite. But it's complicated and I'd rather explain in person if possible. We arranged for her to fly out the following weekend. I didn't tell her about the adoption papers. That conversation needed to happen face to face. The next morning I arrived at Riverside Community Center to find the parking lot fuller than usual. Inside, I discovered why. Word about my inheritance had somehow leaked to the local newspaper, and families were lining up hoping I might expand the center's services. Mrs. Rodriguez, the woman whose housing application I'd been helping with, grabbed my arm as I walked in. David, is it true? Are you really going to open a medical clinic? I'm working on it, Mrs. Rodriguez. It's going to take time, but yes, that's the plan. She started crying and hugged me. My grandson needs surgery for his cleft palate, but our insurance won't cover it. The doctor said it would cost $15,000. Dr. Chen pulled me aside. David, we need to talk. The board met last night, and everyone's very excited about the possibilities. But we're also concerned about managing expectations. People are assuming the health center will solve every medical problem in the community. She was right. As I spent the day meeting with families, I realized that Uncle Theodore's gift came with enormous responsibility. People were counting on me to provide solutions I wasn't sure I could deliver. That afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor at the mansion. Marcus knocked on the front door, looking unusually nervous. I hope you don't mind me stopping by, he said. I wanted to talk to you about something. I invited him into the living room, the same room where we'd played video games as kids during family gatherings. I've been thinking about what Uncle Theodore wrote in that letter, Marcus began, about Robert Henderson and how he handled his firing. I was operations manager then. I could have spoken up, could have found a way to give him the time off he needed. But I didn't. He sat down heavily on the couch. I've been reviewing our employee policies. And David, they're terrible. We offer the bare minimum health insurance, hardly any paid time off, and our turnover rate is astronomical because people can't afford to stay. What are you thinking of doing about it? I want to change things, really change them. But I need help figuring out how to do it without bankrupting the company. You've always been good with people, and after seeing what you've accomplished at the community center? He paused. Would you consider consulting with us? Help us create policies that actually support our employees? This was the last thing I'd expected. Marcus, asking for my help to reform Uncle Theodore's business practices? Are you sure? This would mean significant changes. Higher labor costs, reduced profit margins. Uncle Theodore spent his last months trying to make amends for how he treated people. Maybe it's time the rest of us did the same. Over the next few hours, Marcus and I outlined a plan to completely overhaul the company's approach to employee relations. Better healthcare coverage, paid family leave, profit-sharing programs, even college tuition assistance for employees' children. It would be expensive, but Marcus was convinced it would ultimately save money by reducing turnover and increasing productivity. There's something else, Marcus said as he was leaving. Diana and Patricia want to be involved too. Patricia thinks she can restructure the benefits package to make it more cost-effective. And Diana wants to create a marketing campaign that highlights our commitment to treating employees well. After Marcus left, I sat in Uncle Theodore's study, surrounded by the documents from the safe. I was beginning to understand the full scope of what my uncle had envisioned. This wasn't just about inheriting property. It was about inheriting a mission to use wealth and privilege to help others. But the weight of responsibility was overwhelming. I pulled out my phone and called the one person I thought might understand. Aunt Lillian, it's David. I need some advice. She arrived within an hour, carrying a casserole and a thermos of coffee. You look exhausted, she said, setting the food on the kitchen counter. When's the last time you ate a real meal? As we sat at the kitchen table, I told her about my conversation with Marcus, my plans for the health center, and my fears about living up to Uncle Theodore's expectations. Your uncle was scared too, she said gently. Those last few months he called me almost every night, worrying about whether he'd made the right decisions. He was terrified that you'd reject the inheritance, that you'd think he was trying to buy your forgiveness. Was he? Trying to buy my forgiveness? Aunt Lillian smiled. Theodore was many things, but he wasn't stupid. He knew you couldn't be bought. That's why he respected you so much. No, David, he wasn't trying to buy your forgiveness. He was trying to earn it. She reached across the table and took my hand. You know what he said to me the day before he died? He said, I finally figured out how to be rich. Give it all to someone who knows how to be good. That evening, I made a decision. I called Rebecca Santos back. Rebecca, when you come this weekend, bring whatever documentation you have about your shelter's needs. I think my uncle would want his foundation to do more than just provide funding. I think he'd want it to help you expand. Expand? David, we're barely keeping our current program running. Expansion would require… How much would it cost to double your capacity? Well, we'd need a bigger facility, more staff, additional programs, probably around $2 million. But that's just a dream. There's no way we could raise that kind of money. Let's talk about it when you get here. After hanging up, I walked through the mansion one more time, seeing it with new eyes. This house had been Uncle Theodore's fortress, his symbol of success and power. But it could be something different now. The dining room could host fundraising dinners for the health center. The library could be a quiet space for community board meetings. The large backyard could host health fairs and family events. I thought about Rebecca, flying across the country to meet me, not knowing that she was about to discover a family she'd never known existed. I thought about Marcus, Diana, and Patricia, ready to transform a business built on harsh principles into something more humane. I thought about Mrs. Rodriguez and her grandson, waiting for surgery that might now be possible. Uncle Theodore had spent 8 years believing I hated him. But sitting in his house, surrounded by evidence of his secret generosity and desperate attempts at redemption, I realized something important. I had never hated him. I had hated his choices, his coldness, his treatment of people like Robert Henderson. But the man himself, the man who had quietly funded community programs and secretly helped families in need, that man I could forgive. That man I already had forgiven. Rebecca Santos arrived on Friday evening, and I picked her up from the airport myself. I spotted her immediately. She had Uncle Theodore's distinctive green eyes and the same determined set to her jaw that I remembered from family photos of him as a young man. She was carrying a worn leather briefcase and looked exactly like someone who'd spent years fighting for funding to help homeless teenagers. You must be David, she said, extending her hand. Thank you so much for arranging this. I have to admit, I'm curious about what was so important it couldn't be discussed over the phone. During the drive to the mansion, we talked about her work. Her shelter, called New Horizons, housed up to 30 teenagers at a time and helped them complete their education while providing counseling and job training. She spoke passionately about the kids she'd helped, the success stories that kept her going through the difficult cases. Your uncle's foundation saved us, she said as we pulled into the driveway. 3 years ago, we were about to close. We'd lost our major funding source, and I was looking at putting 60 kids back on the street. Then I got a call from someone representing the Blackwood Foundation, offering to cover our entire operating budget for 3 years. I parked in front of the house, my stomach tight with nerves. Rebecca, before we go inside, I need to tell you something important about your connection to my uncle. Something you probably don't know. Her expression grew concerned. What do you mean? I pulled out the adoption papers Uncle Theodore had left in the safe. You're not just someone my uncle helped. You're his daughter. Rebecca stared at the documents for a long moment, her face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and finally, shock. This can't be right. My adoption records were sealed. My parents told me my birth father was a college student who couldn't take care of a baby. That was true. Uncle Theodore was 23 when you were born. He arranged for your adoption because he thought it was best for you, but he never stopped caring about your welfare. She looked up at the mansion, then back at the papers. He's been watching my life? Supporting me without telling me? He paid for your college education through an anonymous scholarship. He funded your graduate degree. When you started New Horizons, he was your first major donor. Rebecca, your family. Tears began streaming down her face. I have a family? I mean, I had wonderful adoptive parents, but I always wondered. I always felt like there was something missing. I helped her out of the car and led her to the front door. You have more than just Uncle Theodore's memory. You have cousins, an aunt, and apparently a half-brother who's been looking forward to meeting you. Inside the mansion, I showed her Uncle Theodore's study and the contents of the safe. She sat in his chair, reading through his journals, her hands shaking as she discovered entry after entry about her accomplishments, her struggles, his pride in the woman she'd become. Listen to this, she said, reading from a journal dated 2 years earlier. Rebecca received the Mayor's Award for Community Service today. I watched the ceremony online. She looked so much like her mother when she smiled. I wanted to be there, to tell her how proud I am, but I don't have the right. I gave up that right 28 years ago when I signed those papers. She set down the journal and looked at me. Why didn't he ever contact me directly? I think he was afraid you'd reject him. He wrote that he felt he'd abandoned you once and didn't want to disrupt your life again. Rebecca stood up and walked to the window overlooking the garden. All those years I wondered about him created stories in my head about who he might be. I imagined he was probably irresponsible, maybe struggling with addiction or financial problems. I never imagined he was successful and just scared. We spent the next few hours going through everything together. When she saw the architectural plans for the community health center, her eyes lit up. This is incredible. You could provide comprehensive services, medical care, mental health support, addiction counseling. It's exactly what communities like this need. What would it take to create something similar in Los Angeles? I asked. For the teenagers you work with? Rebecca pulled out her briefcase and showed me her own plans, sketches and proposals she'd been developing for years but never had the funding to implement. I've been dreaming of a comprehensive youth center, not just emergency housing, but education programs, job training, health services, even transitional apartments where kids could live while they get on their feet. How much would it cost? To do it right, about $4 million. But David, that's not realistic. Grants that large don't exist for programs like ours. I smiled. Actually, they do. Uncle Theodore left specific instructions for expanding his foundation's reach. Rebecca, what if I told you that the Blackwood Foundation could fund your expansion completely? She stared at me in disbelief. You're serious? Dead serious. Uncle Theodore wanted his money to help people. You've been helping people your entire career. It seems like a perfect match. Saturday morning, Marcus, Diana, and Patricia arrived to meet Rebecca. The reunion was emotional. They'd known Uncle Theodore had a daughter somewhere, but had never expected to meet her. Rebecca was overwhelmed by suddenly having not just one family member, but an entire extended family. We're planning to reform Dad's businesses, Diana explained over breakfast. Make them more employee-friendly, more community-focused. Would you be interested in consulting with us? Your experience with social programs could help us figure out how to support our workers better. I'd love to, Rebecca replied, but I have to ask, why now? What changed? Patricia answered honestly, David changed our perspective. When we saw how he'd been living his life, using his skills to help others instead of accumulating wealth, it made us realize we'd been following the wrong example. Uncle Theodore realized it too, Marcus added. His letter made it clear that he spent his last years regretting how he'd built his empire. Now we want to rebuild it the right way. After my cousins left, Rebecca and I drove to the community center so she could see the work I'd been doing. She met Mrs. Rodriguez and several other families I'd been helping, and I could see her mind working, imagining how similar programs could benefit the teenagers in her shelter. You know what strikes me about this place? She said as we walked through the center. It's not just about providing services. You've created a community. People trust you. They feel safe here. That's the hardest part of what we do, building that trust. That afternoon, we visited the empty building that would become the health center. Rebecca walked through the space with the eye of someone who'd designed programs from scratch, offering suggestions for layout and functionality. You should have a dedicated space for teenagers, she said. They have different needs than adults or small children. Maybe something that feels less clinical, more like a coffee shop or community center. Would you help me design it? I asked. Are you kidding? Try to stop me. Sunday evening, as we sat in Uncle Theodore's library, Rebecca asked the question I'd been dreading. David, do you think he would have been proud of me if he'd known me as a person, not just watched from a distance? I thought about the journals, the careful records he'd kept of her achievements, the way his handwriting became shaky when he wrote about missing important moments in her life. Rebecca, I think you were the accomplishment he was most proud of. In all his journals, all his records, the entries about you are the only ones where he never second-guessed himself. He never questioned whether supporting your work was the right decision. He knew you were making the world better, and that was enough for him. She wiped away tears. I wish I could have told him that I understood, that I don't blame him for the choice he made. Maybe you can still tell him, I suggested. He's buried in Millbrook Cemetery. We could visit tomorrow before your flight. Monday morning, we stood together at Uncle Theodore's grave. Rebecca had brought flowers, sunflowers, because she'd read in his journal that they were his favorites. She knelt beside the headstone and spoke quietly. Dad, I know you're probably surprised to hear me call you that. I never thought I'd have the chance to talk to you, but David tells me you were always listening. I want you to know that I had a good life. My adoptive parents were wonderful, and the choice you made gave me opportunities I might never have had otherwise. I'm not angry. I understand. She paused, touching the headstone gently. I'm going to take care of your foundation, and I'm going to help David build something amazing here. We're going to help people, just like you tried to do at the end. I think you'd like that. As we walked back to the car, Rebecca linked her arm through mine. Thank you for giving me the chance to get to know him, even if it's too late. It's not too late, I said. Uncle Theodore might be gone, but his legacy is just beginning. And now we get to write the next chapter together. That evening, after Rebecca's flight back to Los Angeles, I sat in Uncle Theodore's study, looking at the family photo on his desk. It was from a Christmas gathering about 15 years ago, before our argument, when the family was still whole. Uncle Theodore stood in the center, surrounded by children and grandchildren, looking stern but proud. Tomorrow, I would start the renovation of the health center. Next month, Rebecca would begin planning her youth center expansion. By the end of the year, Marcus, Diana, and Patricia hoped to have completely transformed their employment practices. Uncle Theodore had spent his life building an empire. Now his family was going to spend their lives building something better, a legacy of compassion that would outlast any business or fortune. The house felt different now, not like a monument to one man's success, but like the beginning of something new, something that would have made Uncle Theodore proud. 1 year later, I stood in the main lobby of the David Blackwood Community Health Center, watching Dr. Martinez examine Mrs. Rodriguez's grandson, Carlos. The boy's cleft palate surgery had been a complete success, funded through our sliding scale fee program. He was scheduled for his final follow-up appointment, and his smile was radiant. "Mr. David," Carlos called out, running toward me with the enthusiasm only a 7-year-old could muster. "Look, Dr. Martinez says my mouth is perfect now." Mrs. Rodriguez followed behind him, tears in her eyes. "1 year ago we had no hope," she said, squeezing my hand. "Now my grandson can speak clearly, eat properly, and smile without shame. You changed our lives." The health center had opened 6 months earlier, ahead of schedule and under budget thanks to Marcus's project management skills and Diana's ability to negotiate with contractors. What had started as Uncle Theodore's vision had become a reality that exceeded even his ambitious plans. The building now housed 12 examination rooms, a full-service pharmacy, mental health counseling offices, and a children's therapeutic play area that Rebecca had designed based on her experience with traumatized youth. We'd added services Uncle Theodore hadn't even imagined: a dental clinic, vision care, and even a small surgical suite for minor procedures. But the real success was measured in lives changed. Over 300 families had received care in our first 6 months. We'd helped 15 people overcome addiction through our counseling programs. Our job training workshops had placed 42 adults in stable employment. The children's mental health services had transformed the local elementary school's approach to dealing with trauma. My phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca in Los Angeles. "Grand opening of New Horizons West tomorrow. 30 teenagers moved into transitional housing this week. Uncle T would be amazed at what we've built." Rebecca's expanded youth center had become a model for similar programs across California. She'd used Uncle Theodore's funding to create not just emergency shelter, but a comprehensive support system that helped young people transition from homelessness to independence. The success rate was unprecedented. Over 80% of the teenagers who completed her program were still housed and employed 2 years later. David? Dr. Sarah Chen appeared at my elbow. The mayor's here for the anniversary celebration. She wants to discuss expanding the model to other neighborhoods. I nodded, straightening my tie. Today marked exactly 1 year since Uncle Theodore's will reading, and we were hosting a community celebration to showcase what had been accomplished. The entire Blackwood family would be here, along with city officials, community leaders, and many of the families we'd helped. As I walked toward the main conference room, I passed the wall of stories, a display Rebecca had suggested where families could share their experiences. Photos and testimonials covered an entire hallway, each one representing a life that had been touched by Uncle Theodore's legacy. There was a photo of James Henderson, Robert's son, graduating from college with a degree in social work. He'd received one of the scholarships we'd established for children of families affected by the old Blackwood hardware store's policies. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The son of a man Uncle Theodore had wronged was now following in my footsteps, helping other families in need. Another photo showed the Chen family, no relation to Dr. Chen or Mrs. Chen, the housekeeper, celebrating the birth of their daughter. The mother had received prenatal care at our center when she couldn't afford a private doctor. Their baby had been born healthy, and they'd named her Hope. The conference room was packed. Mayor Williams sat at the head table alongside Marcus, Diana, and Patricia. The three of them had indeed transformed the Blackwood business empire over the past year. Employee satisfaction surveys showed dramatic improvements. Turnover had dropped by 70%. Productivity was at an all-time high. Most surprisingly, profits had actually increased as a result of the more humane policies. Ladies and gentlemen, Mayor Williams began, 1 year ago, this community lost a complicated man named Theodore Blackwood. Today we celebrate how his family has honored his memory by creating something extraordinary. She gestured toward a large screen that displayed statistics from our first year. Medical procedures performed, counseling sessions completed, jobs created, families housed. The numbers were impressive, but they didn't capture the real impact. What makes this achievement special, the mayor continued, isn't just the services provided, but the model it represents. The Blackwood family has shown that inherited wealth can be transformed into inherited responsibility. Marcus stood to address the crowd. A year ago, my uncle left my cousin David a house and a challenge. He challenged all of us to be better than we had been, to use our resources to help others rather than just accumulate more for ourselves. He looked directly at me. David, you could have sold the house, kept the money, and continued living quietly. Instead, you've built something that will outlast all of us. You've shown us what Uncle Theodore meant when he wrote that success isn't measured by what you accumulate, but by what you contribute. Diana took the microphone next. Our business transformation wouldn't have been possible without David's guidance. He taught us that treating employees well isn't just morally right, it's also good business. Our stores are now models for other companies looking to improve their workplace culture. Patricia added, we've established the Theodore Blackwood Employee Assistance Fund, which provides emergency financial help for any worker facing medical crises, housing problems, or family emergencies. It's funded by a percentage of our profits, ensuring that our success directly benefits the people who make it possible. When it was my turn to speak, I walked to the podium feeling the weight of the moment. In the audience, I could see Mrs. Rodriguez with Carlos, the Henderson family, dozens of other families we'd helped, and my own family members who had become partners in this mission. A year ago, I thought I was attending a will reading where I'd be forgotten, I began. Instead, I discovered that my uncle had been watching, learning, and planning. He'd realized that the most valuable thing he could leave wasn't money or property, but an opportunity to make a difference. I paused, looking at the faces in the crowd. Uncle Theodore spent his last years trying to make amends for the hardness he'd shown earlier in life, but I think he would be amazed to see how his legacy has grown beyond anything he imagined. This health center, the business reforms, Rebecca's youth programs in Los Angeles, they're all connected by a simple idea: that privilege comes with responsibility. that if you're fortunate enough to have resources, you have an obligation to use them to help others. I pulled out a letter I'd written the night before. Last night, I wrote a letter to Uncle Theodore. I wanted to tell him what we've accomplished, but also what we've learned. I learned that forgiveness isn't just about pardoning past mistakes. It's about transforming those mistakes into motivation for future good. I learned that family isn't just about blood relationships. It's about shared values and mutual support. Rebecca became my sister, not because we share DNA, but because we share a commitment to helping people. Most importantly, I learned that wealth isn't about what you own. It's about what you can create for others. Uncle Theodore accumulated money, but what he really built was an opportunity for all of us to become better people. I folded the letter and looked up at the crowd. So today, we're not just celebrating a successful health center or business reforms. We're celebrating the transformation of a family legacy, from one of accumulation to one of contribution. The audience erupted in applause. As people began to mingle and share stories, I stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. Aunt Lillian joined me on the steps. "Theodore would be so proud," she said, linking her arm through mine. "You know, the night before he died, he told me he finally understood the difference between being successful and being significant." "What's the difference?" I asked. "Success is about what you achieve for yourself. Significance is about what you make possible for others." As the celebration continued inside, I thought about the journey that had brought us here. Uncle Theodore's death had seemed like an ending, but it had actually been a beginning. His will hadn't just distributed his assets, it had redistributed his family's priorities. My phone buzzed with another text from Rebecca, "Thinking of you today. Uncle T would love seeing the family working together like this. Can't wait to visit next month and see the new pediatric wing." I smiled, typing back, "He's watching, I'm sure of it." 6 months later, I received a call that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. Robert Henderson was on the line. "David, I hope you don't mind me calling. I heard about everything you've done with your uncle's legacy, and I wanted you to know something." "Of course, Mr. Henderson, what is it?" "My son James just graduated from social work school. He wants to apply for a position at your health center. But before he does, I wanted to thank your family for giving him the scholarship that made his education possible." He paused, his voice becoming emotional. "When your uncle fired me, I thought my family's future was destroyed. I never imagined that his nephew would end up giving my son opportunities I could never have provided. It's like a circle completing itself. Mr. Henderson, we'd be honored to have James on our team, and sir, I think Uncle Theodore would be honored too." That evening, I sat in Uncle Theodore's study, my study now, working on plans for expanding the health center model to 3 other neighborhoods. The desk was covered with architectural drawings, budget proposals, and letters from families requesting services. On the wall hung a framed copy of Uncle Theodore's final letter to me, alongside photos from the health center's opening day. But the item I treasured most was a small handwritten note I'd found tucked inside one of his journals. "If you're reading this, David, then you've forgiven an old fool his mistakes. Thank you for becoming the man I should have been. Use everything wisely, love generously, and never forget that the best inheritance isn't what you leave behind. It's who you inspire to carry on. Your Uncle Theodore." Looking out the window at the garden where Uncle Theodore had once walked alone, I realized that the mansion was no longer a monument to one man's wealth. It had become the heart of a community effort that touched hundreds of lives. Uncle Theodore had been right about one thing. Love always finds a way. Sometimes it takes years, sometimes it requires tragedy to reveal itself, but it always finds a way. The will reading that had started with my name being skipped had ended with my name being attached to something far more valuable than any inheritance. It was attached to a legacy of compassion that would outlive all of us. And somewhere I believed Uncle Theodore was finally at peace. 3 months after that conversation with Robert Henderson, I received a package that would change everything once again. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier who insisted I sign for it personally. The return address was from a law firm in Boston I'd never heard of, Pemberton, Walsh & Associates. Inside was a thick manila envelope containing documents that made my hands shake as I read them. Apparently, Uncle Theodore had one final surprise that even Mr. Whitman hadn't known about. He'd established a trust 20 years earlier, managed by the Boston firm, that had been growing quietly through investments and compound interest. The trust was worth $12 million. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was the purpose clause written in Uncle Theodore's own handwriting. To be released to David Michael Blackwood on the 2nd anniversary of my death, provided he has demonstrated the wisdom and compassion necessary to honor the Blackwood name through service to others. Attached was a letter from the Boston attorneys explaining that they'd been monitoring news coverage of the health center and the business reforms. Uncle Theodore had given them specific criteria to evaluate: evidence of sustained community service, financial transparency in charitable endeavors, and family unity in pursuing philanthropic goals. We had apparently exceeded every benchmark. The letter from Uncle Theodore that accompanied the trust documents was longer than any he'd written before. David, if you're reading this, then you've proven that my faith in you was justified. But more than that, you've proven that redemption is possible for our entire family. I established this trust as insurance, not against failure, but against success, corrupting the very values that made you worthy of inheritance in the first place. $12 million is enough to expand your work beyond anything you've imagined, but it's also enough to destroy everything you've built if used carelessly. I trust you to know the difference. There are conditions, of course. Half the money must be used to establish health centers in underserved communities across the state. 1/4 should fund Rebecca's expansion into other cities. The final quarter is yours to use as you see fit, but with one requirement. You must involve the entire family in deciding how to use it. I've watched families destroyed by sudden wealth, and I've seen others transformed by shared purpose. I believe the Blackwoods are destined for transformation. Your loving uncle, who finally learned that the best way to live forever is to plant trees in whose shade you'll never sit. I called an emergency family meeting for that weekend. Marcus flew in from a business trip to Chicago. Diana canceled a marketing conference in Seattle. Patricia rearranged her vacation plans. Rebecca took a red-eye flight from Los Angeles. Even Aunt Lillian, who rarely involved herself in financial discussions, insisted on attending. We gathered in the mansion's library, the same room where Uncle Theodore used to conduct his most important business meetings. The trust documents lay spread across the mahogany table like a treasure map to possibilities none of us had imagined. $12 million, Patricia said, shaking her head in disbelief. He really was planning for everything, wasn't he? Look at this list, Diana said, pointing to an appendix in the trust documents. He identified 17 communities across the state that need health centers. He researched demographics, existing medical facilities, transportation issues, everything we'd need to know to replicate our model. Marcus was studying the financial projections. These numbers are incredible. If we follow his plan, we could potentially serve over 50,000 people within 5 years. Rebecca had been quiet, reading through a separate section of documents that pertained to her youth programs. He wanted me to expand to San Francisco, Sacramento, and San Diego, she said softly. He even identified potential properties and calculated staffing needs. I looked around the table at my family, because that's what we'd become, all of us, bound together by shared purpose, rather than just shared blood. So what do you think? Are we ready to take on something this big? The question isn't whether we're ready, Aunt Lillian said firmly. The question is whether we're worthy of the trust Theodore placed in us. Over the next 6 months, we proved that we were. The second Blackwood Community Health Center opened in Riverside County, serving a predominantly agricultural community where workers often went without medical care due to cost and language barriers. We hired bilingual staff and created mobile clinics that could reach the most remote farms. The third center launched in a former industrial town where the main employer had closed, leaving thousands of families without health insurance. We partnered with the local community college to provide job retraining programs alongside medical services. Rebecca's San Francisco Youth Center became a model for other cities struggling with homeless teenagers. She developed innovative programs that combined housing assistance with education and mental health support, achieving success rates that attracted attention from social workers nationwide. But perhaps the most unexpected development came from Marcus, Diana, and Patricia's business reforms. Their employee-first approach had attracted so much positive attention that other companies began requesting consultation services. They established Blackwood Employee Solutions, a consulting firm that helped businesses implement humane workplace policies. "We're basically teaching other companies how to treat people decently," Diana explained during one of our monthly family meetings, "and they're paying us for it." Uncle Theodore would find that hilarious. The success stories multiplied exponentially. Children received surgeries they couldn't afford. Families found stable housing. Adults overcame addictions. Teenagers escaped homelessness. Small businesses learned to value their workers. But the real measure of our success came in unexpected moments. Like the day I received a wedding invitation from Sofia Martinez, the little girl I'd read to in the hospital years earlier. She was grown now, healthy and marrying her college sweetheart. The invitation included a note. "Mr. David, thank you for showing me that there are always people who care, even when everything seems dark." Or the afternoon when James Henderson, now a full-time counselor at our original health center, told me about helping a family navigate the same insurance crisis his own family had faced years earlier. "It's strange," he said. "I can help them because I understand exactly what they're going through." My father's suffering became the foundation for my ability to help others. On the second anniversary of Uncle Theodore's death, we held a memorial service at his grave. The entire extended family was there, along with dozens of people whose lives had been touched by his posthumous generosity. Mrs. Rodriguez brought Carlos, now a healthy, confident 9-year-old. Robert Henderson came with his son James. Rebecca brought 3 teenagers from her Los Angeles program who wanted to thank the family that had made their recovery possible. As we stood around the headstone, I realized that Uncle Theodore had achieved something remarkable. He'd transformed his death into a beginning rather than an ending. His legacy wasn't preserved in bronze plaques or building names, but in the lives of people who were healthier, housed, employed, and hopeful because of the family mission he'd inspired. "He's probably watching us," Rebecca whispered to me as the service concluded, "wondering if we'll keep growing or if we'll get comfortable with what we've accomplished." I smiled, thinking about the newest projects we were planning. A health center in partnership with a Native American reservation. A youth program specifically for LGBTQ+ teenagers. A small business incubator that would help former patients start their own companies. "I don't think comfortable is in our vocabulary anymore," I replied. That evening, as I sat in Uncle Theodore's study reviewing proposals for our next expansion, I found myself writing him another letter. "Dear Uncle Theodore, it's been 2 years since you changed all our lives. Today we broke ground on our 4th health center. Rebecca's programs are operating in 4 cities. Your business has become a model for ethical employment practices. Most importantly, we've stayed together as a family united by purpose, rather than divided by greed. You were right about redemption being possible, but what you might not have realized is that redemption isn't a destination. It's a journey that requires constant commitment to being better than you were yesterday. Thank you for showing us that the greatest inheritance isn't what you leave behind, but what you inspire others to build forward. Your grateful nephew, David." I sealed the letter and placed it in the desk drawer next to all the others I'd written to him over the past 2 years. Someday, maybe I'd share them with my own children, or with the next generation of Blackwoods who would inherit this mission. Outside the window, the garden Uncle Theodore had once walked alone was now filled with the laughter of children whose families came for community events at the mansion. The house that had once been a fortress of isolation had become a center of connection. The will reading that had skipped my name had ultimately given me something more valuable than any inheritance. It had given me purpose, family, and the knowledge that even the most broken relationships can be healed by choosing to love forward rather than looking backward. Uncle Theodore was indeed finally at peace, and so, for the first time in years, was I. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.